Alright guys, in the last video we made it so that we could fetch our items from the item controller and we could then use the UI controller to insert them into the user interface. So now what I want to do is work on adding a meal item with the calories. So obviously that's going to happen through an event. So what we're going to do is go down to our main app controller and we want to go, let's see, right at the top. And instead of putting all of our events, just putting them in there, I'm going to create a function here or a function expression called load event listeners, and then all of our events will go inside of there, okay, or our initial events. So let's say load event listeners, and we're going to create a variable here, load event listeners, set that to a function, and then this is where we're going to put them. So what I want to do is when we call an event, okay, we're going to need to do some selecting like we did here, query selector. So we're going to want to use the UI selectors. Now, since UI selectors is a private, it's actually a private variable in the UI controller, we can't access it directly. What we're going to do is create a public method that will allow us to get the selectors. Okay, so we're going to go under the populate item list, put a comma right here, and we'll call this get selectors. All right, and then all we have to do is return UI selectors. Okay, so now we can go down here and we're going to create a variable here called UI selectors and set that equal to UI controller dot get selectors. That way we can use them in our app controller here. Okay, so we're going to need an event to add an item, right? So let's say add item event. Actually, let's not use uppercase. All right, so add item event. So we're going to say document dot query selector, and then we're going to want this button right here. Okay, and if we look at the HTML, it has a class. Where is it? It has a class of add-btn. So what we're going to do is add that to our UI selectors. So up here, let's say we'll call this add-btn, set it to the class of add-btn. All right, and then we can go down here and we can say query selector UI selectors dot add btn dot add event listener. Okay, we're going to listen for a click, and then we're going to call a function called item add submit. Okay, and item add submit is going to go under the load event listeners function. So right here we'll say add item submit, and it's going to be const item add submit equals function. We're going to pass our event object in here like that, and then we want to prevent the default behavior, so we're going to say e dot prevent default. And just to test it out, let's say console.log add. All right, so if we save this and I go and put something in here and click add, nothing happens because this load event listeners function is not being called anywhere. So this is actually going to get called inside of our init. All right, so let's go down to the init, and we're going to put this. Actually, I'm going to put this in last. So let's say load load event listeners, and we're going to call load event listeners. All right, so now let's try it. And now we get add, okay? So what do we want to do when we first submit an item here? What we want to do is make sure that there's actually something here, okay? So let's see, we'll get rid of the console log. And in order to check to make sure that there's something here, we need to get the input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that to a UI controller method called getItemInput. All right, so let's say get form input from UI controller. So we'll say const, we're going to put it into a variable, and we're going to set it to UI controller dot get item input. All right, so let's go up to the UI controller, and we'll go, let's see, we'll just go right here, and we'll say get item input. And we want to return an object with the name and calories, right? So how do we get this stuff? How do we get it from the form? We need to use a selector. All right, now remember, these inputs, they have an ID, right? Let's see what that is. So let's see, this one is ID of item name, this one is ID of item calories. So we need to add these to our UI selectors. So let's go up here, and let's call this one item name. Actually, start with a lowercase. Item name input, and it's an ID of item dash name. All right, then we want item calories input. Set that to an ID of item dash calories. Okay, so now we're going to go back down to our get input, and let's see, we're going to put here document dot query query selector, and it's going to be UI selectors dot item name input dot value. Okay, since it's an input, we need to get the dot value, and then we're going to do the same thing for the calories. So I'll just copy this, and let's paste that in and change this to item calories input. Okay, so that's going to return an object with the name and the calories. So let's go back down to right here, and let's just make sure that we actually are getting that stuff. So we'll say console log input. All right, so we'll just put whatever, submit, and now you can see we're getting an object with the name and the calories. Good. So let's make sure that there's actually something entered in there. Now, I'm not going to do anything special like flash messaging, or anything like that. It's just not going to. They're just not going to be able to add something if both of these aren't filled. All right, you guys can handle it differently if you want, but I really don't think it's a big deal. So what we'll do, let me see. We're just going to do an if. We'll say check for So we'll say, if I'm trying to comment this really good so you guys can know exactly what's going on. So let's say if input, remember that's an object, so we can access .name. So if input.name is not equal to nothing, and input.calories is not equal to nothing, then we can proceed. All right, so then let's just console.log 1, 2, 3. So if I go and I just click add, you'll see no 1, 2, 3. If I put one of them in, nothing. I put both of them in, that goes through. Okay. So what we want to do now is, let's say, add item. So that's going to be in the item controller dot add item, and we're going to pass in. Actually, I'm sorry. We need to set this to a variable. Call it new item, because we're going to need this after so that we can update the UI. But let's go ahead and say item controller add item, and we're going to pass in input.name and input.calories. Okay. So we're going to go create this function, this method, add item, up here in the item controller. So we'll go right under get items and we'll say add item. All right, and that takes in the name and calories. And just to make sure it's working, we'll console log name calories. Okay, so you can see that that's logging good. All right, now this is going to be a little bit confusing for some people because we need to generate an ID, okay? Because remember, these items have IDs, and that's how we're going to identify them in certain places. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the items, and we're going to try to make it kind of like an auto increment. So let's say that this is ID 3. We want the next one to be 4, and so on. So we're going to do a little bit of logic here. So let's say create ID, and we're going to say if the data.items.length is greater than 0. This is going to have an else as well. So if it's greater than 0, we're going to do something. But if it's not, then obviously we want the ID. We're going to make the ID equal to 0. Actually, let's go up here and say let ID. All right, so ID will be 0 then. If not, or if it's greater than 0, what we want to do is make the ID data.items, and then we want the index to be the length -1. Okay, so if there's 4, we want this to be 3. So we can do this by saying data.items.length -1. All right, and then we want the ID of that particular item, and then we just want to add 1 to it. Okay, so this will give us a sense of auto increment. Okay, so that will create the ID, and then we also want to take the calories and we want to parse it as a number, because when we initially type it in, it's going to be a string. So let's say calories to number, and a while back we learned about the parse int. So let's say const calories equals parse int calories. Actually, I'm sorry, I don't want this here. So calories equals parse int calories. So that'll change it to a number. All right, then we want to create a new item. Now remember, our item, we have a constructor up here. So when we want a new item, we need to say new, the keyword new item, and then pass in the data. Okay. So we'll do new item equals new item. Okay, that's going to call the constructor, and we're going to pass in the ID, the name, and the calories. Okay, and then what we want to do is push that new item to this right here, okay, to the data structure. So we'll say data.items.push, and we'll pass in the new item. put a comment here. Add to items array. Okay, and then we're simply going to return the new item, because remember we're going to put it into a variable down below. All right, so let's save this. Now, if I go ahead and I add something here, let's say test meal, we'll say 2,000 calories, add. All right, now nothing happened in the UI, and that's it shouldn't, because we haven't done anything with the UI. What we've done is updated our data structure. Now remember, we have this log data function or method right here that we can use. So let's check that out. Let's say item controller log data, and now you can see that there's 4 items in there. Let's take a look, and our test meal is in there. And it has an ID of 3, okay? Because the other ones are 0, 1, 2. This one has an ID of 3. Test meal calories is 2,000. All right, so it's working perfectly. It added the data it added the item to the data structure. All right, now adding it down here below, this is a function of the UI controller. So that's what we're going to do next, is actually add it to the UI.